Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be analyzing games number 25 and 26 from the Mack vs. Machine series, in which I'm playing 100 games of Scrabble against the top online Scrabble bot, HastyBot. Now, this is not a typical Mack vs. Machine video, where I'll play a full game and then analyze it on the same video. Unfortunately, there seems to be an issue with the video files for Game 25 and Game 26, where the audio didn't carry through to the recording. I published Game 25 at the typical time yesterday, only to be alerted soon after that there was no audio. So my poor viewers were just watching me play Scrabble in silence, which I have to imagine was fairly boring and certainly not that entertaining. So I do sincerely apologize for that. I've taken that video down and will do a better job of making sure that doesn't happen again in the future. Now, the good news is that the issue did not continue. I already checked the files for games 27 and beyond that I've pre-recorded, and it didn't continue for those games. But the bad news is it did also affect game number 26 in addition to 25, so both of those video files do appear unusable. As such, what I'm going to be doing is, in this video, I'll do, instead of going through the game as I'm playing it, which unfortunately I can't do, I'll be doing a more in-depth analysis portion of these two games, and then going back starting tomorrow or Wednesday to our normal schedule when I'll publish game number 27, which will be a more typical video of me playing the game and then analyzing it afterwards. So hopefully you guys still find this interesting. I did this once, I believe, on game 9, where I had a different recording issue, and I do think the analysis was still useful and entertaining, so I hope that's the case here. And hope you guys can still learn something out of these two games, which I do think were both interesting, so I'd hate to skip them entirely. And yeah, once again, I do apologize for this, guys. I'll try to do a better job to make sure this doesn't happen again, but I hope you enjoy this video, and without further ado, let's jump right in. So in game 1, HastyBot has the blank in the queue to open, and he has an interesting decision to start things off. He can play the word quay for 56 points, which is what he does, burning the blank, or he can hold on to the blank with probably the play of quin for 26, keeping GH blank. Now, both of these options are defensible, but quay does look a bit stronger. It's 30 points, which is worth a little bit more than the blank static value, which I believe is around 28. And GH is just a little bit clunky, so the upside of keeping the blank this early in the game, which would be to increase your bingo percentage, is a little bit offset by keeping the G and the H together. So I think with all that considered, the slightly clunky leave to go with the blank and the extra 30 points, spending the blank here, makes a lot of sense. So I think I would have done the same thing. Here I've got a bit of a clunky position to start things off. I've got some decent bingo tiles, but the CPV is unfortunately just one too many high pointer to make this work. I'm close to things like province, but unfortunately I don't quite have that. So I've got a few decent options here. The main things I looked at were pivot, which I eventually played, as well as Coven through this eye. The main difference is that Coven does set up this hook for me next turn, since Covine is valid, so it would give me a good place to maybe play a 7-letter bingo over here next turn if I can draw one. The problem is it, of course, also gives my opponent the opportunity to use that spot, and it also takes a G for coving as well as an S for covens, so there's a lot of ways he could hook that word and then play horizontally, and the problem is if he does that, then there aren't going to really be a lot of good bingo lines left for me on the board, especially to make 7s. So I felt that I'd probably be helping him just as much as I was helping myself the next turn, and in the long term especially, I really wouldn't be shaping the board the way I wanted to, given I'm already at a deficit and should be trying to bingo as soon as I can to come back. The other option of Vin, which I looked at I think very briefly, has a similar issue. Of course, it takes an E and an O, which I have, but it also takes an A, and he's extremely likely to have one of these tiles and play across using the hook, and similarly to Coven, it'll just leave me very little to work with on my next turn. So with pivot, I do give back some scoring opportunities down here on the H column, but the good news for me is if he does play there, he might be scoring a bit, but he'll also be giving me a lot of floaters to work through horizontally that I can hopefully get a bingo down through next turn. So I felt this made pivot the best choice, just to keep things as open as possible for me in the long run. Here he responds with Townie, which looks like a good play. He's got a pretty clunky rack with a lot of consonants, and this scores about as well as he can. Also really doesn't give anything back to me. So this looks like a good choice. Here, there wasn't much else for me to consider other than Wincy. It's so many more points than everything else. It opens up some good floaters for me, and BL isn't an amazing leave, but it's especially with an E and a Y, it's not bad, since I have decent potential to draw words ending in, say, ABLE or ABLY next turn. Here he finds a nice play of Godisha through this TI, which looks quite solid. It scores considerably more than any of his other options. I don't like something like Nudge here. AT is a little bit better than OT, but it's not 6 points better, and he does still have a slight lead, and there's no good reason to give back this line over here, hooking Nudge to make nudges or nudged, or another E to bingo through. So I think Godisha looks perfectly good here. I have a bit of an interesting choice here. I went with Boxla, which is probably the more aggressive play. The main advantage is it sets up my S next turn for easy 40-point plays in the corner. Other options, the main things I considered were Box in the same spot, as well as Bleak through the E. And the main thing that's nice about Bleak is it keeps the X for this scoring spot with Ox next turn. Like if I can draw an O, I'll have Ox there for 40 points. An I will often give me plays as well. So that's one advantage of Bleak. Boxla, again, the main advantage is setting up my S for the next turn. Of course, I do run the risk that he also has an S, but I felt that this way, now I have two really strong S spots, since I have the Boxla's hook, and if that gets taken, I also have the Quay's hook, which will be an extremely important place for me to bingo later on in the game, or possibly even just score a lot of points with my K on the next turn. So I felt that given I had an S, I wanted to try to maximize this value as much as possible, and I thought Boxla was probably worth it. Box is also interesting just because this leave could be very strong, especially with an E floating, but I felt it was just a little bit too consonant heavy, and especially with the K, I don't think it's all that likely to bingo, and if I don't bingo, I'm not really leaving myself that great a future for the next turn after Box, so I think Boxla's quite reasonable here. Here he played Oxo, which looks okay. I don't love keeping the F, but it is decent for scoring, and I definitely don't like plays like Fool over here. It's not necessary at this point to give back this F. It's certainly not a great tile, but it really doesn't work that badly with EILT. You could also consider Folio over here, which is also reasonable. I think it's probably between Oxo and Folio. The nice thing about the EF-ILT leave is even ELT on this board, it's in a vacuum is better as a bingo leave than keeping the F, I would imagine, but there really aren't a lot of places here to bingo on this board, right? Especially without an S for the Quay's hook. So keeping the F as a bit of a counterbalance to hopefully score next turn if he can't bingo, or maybe score more if I do open up a new hotspot, does make some sense. So I think Oxo is a perfectly good play here for him. And now here, this was my biggest mistake of the game. So this is another episode of what we call tunnel vision in Scrabble, and in this case, I tunneled on the Boxla spot I just opened, since the main point of my play of Boxla was to open up that S hook for me to score in the corner with, so I just quickly jumped to the conclusion that that's what I needed to do, and played Chris for 43 points. And unfortunately, I missed the nice play of Snarkier through this A and this E, which I did also open last turn for myself by playing Boxla, but I didn't see here, unfortunately. And this is way better because it scores one more point and keeps a much better leave. It keeps just a single R as opposed to the N and the duplicate R. So this is a substantial mistake in this position. And again, just an important reminder to always look over the whole board, even if you open a spot for yourself or make a setup play next turn and you draw what you need to use it, that does not necessarily mean it's going to be the best play. So it's always important to think about what you've opened for yourself, what your opponent might have opened for you, and also what was already open on the board before your last play. Here he plays Flea Bite, which is his only bingo. I've got a bunch of options here. I could play Trank to this Q, which is my biggest scoring play. I could play Roll over here, which does set up my T for Troll. The problem is there's also 3 Ds unseen for Droll, so this is a pretty risky play. And I didn't feel I was in that bad a position here after Tolar. Of course, another really scary spot is this Flea Bites hook, since that's on a double word score. So if he can get a word from this triple letter score down here, especially with a Z or a J, it's going to score like 80, and even something with an F, like if he just plays Files over there, that's going to score about 60 points, and that'll really hurt and start putting me out of reach even with a bingo. So I felt after Tolar, I'm only going to be down 30. There's not really any disaster scenarios on the board. There's still 3 S's and a blank for me to draw. I don't really need to be panicking at this point, and I'd rather take the more conservative approach, stop him from quickly running away with the game and hoping to just draw a little better next turn and pick up something that will allow me to hopefully bingo or score a bit more points. Here he goes over here, which seems reasonable. He's got 2 U's, so he really needs to get rid of 1 ASAP. He does at least block this R, which is a nice bingo line that I just opened. And DENU, not the best leave ever, but certainly not the worst. And it's just as good as any of these other leaves we see here that are options for him. He doesn't really have any good ways to get rid of both of his U's. So I think that's a reasonable play. Here I had a nice draw. It's really just a matter of earners versus re-earns in this spot. Earners does take a front Y, which I noticed, but that's not really a factor here since there's no Y's unseen. There is a blank, but the odds of him making the blank a Y and using this spot are extremely slim. So I ultimately went with re-earns just because it exposes 3 different floaters as opposed to 4, right? So here I expose an R, an E, and an A. There's 2 different E's, but really it's only 1 unique tile I'm giving him to work with for bingos, whereas after earners, I give back E, A, R, and N, so 4 unique tiles, and thus re-earns will slightly reduce his bingo percentage next turn, and I will be taking a small lead, so I felt that made sense. So I think re-earns is perfectly fine. He had a terrible draw. He gets down undo, which seems reasonable. It's still 14 points, and EEN, not a great leave, especially with these E's floating, but it's still certainly better than exchanging, given he can get 14. And this was an interesting turn for me. So I spent a while convincing myself there were no bingos. I do have Ageists and Sagiest as 7s. Neither of them play. And it looks like there should be some bingos through this R or maybe one of the E's or the A in re-earns, but there are no bingos available, as I did correctly conclude. So there were 3 main options I considered here, which are the 3 top equity choices, Gales through this L, Ageism, which I eventually played, as well as Gale. So with Gale, the main benefit isn't really so much keeping the second S. The S's are actually not that useful on this board. Undo doesn't take an S, and there really aren't any S hooks on this board, so I don't feel a need to keep the second S. I do still want to keep one of them since they are the last S's, and it could be very useful for me for setups or scoring plays in the long run. So I definitely don't want to get rid of both of them, but keeping 2 as opposed to 1 seems to have little value in this position. So the main benefit of Gal is setting up the E hook for Egal that I do have, but I just didn't feel that was that strong because number 1, there's still 5 E's left where HastyBot could use that spot, and number 2, my my leave is a little bit too constant heavy to have a good chance at hitting that spot. EISST is a great leave for bingos, but it's not going to actually draw that many 7s ending in an E. Probably a rack with 3 vowels and 2 consonants would be better for that in general than a rack with 2 vowels and 3 consonants. So I didn't feel that the upsides of Gal were that strong. Gals does not take an E because Egal is an adjective. Egals is not valid. So this one is a bit better for scoring an equity, so I quickly discounted Gal, and I was between Gals and Ageism, so Gal's EIST is of course a more balanced leave, but Ageism does score 8 more points, and in a close game, those 8 points could be very important. And I also do have these 2 E's as well as this A that I floated with re-earns on my last turn, and that's what ultimately tipped the scales for me in terms of playing Ageism. Normally, ST is considerably weaker than EIST, but between these vowels unseen, there's also still 5 E's and 4 I's unseen, so there's plenty of vowels for me to pick up there to hopefully redraw the tiles I'm spending to play ageism. I'm also turning over 2 extra tiles for another shot at the blank. So with all those factors considered, I felt that ageism was worth the extra 8 points. Here he plays WO, which is probably reasonable. He could consider Tweed for a little more bingo defense, but the problem is he's still going to be down 10 points, and LON is a terrible leave on this board after, since there'll be very few places to bingo, and it's not going to be good for scoring for him in the future, so I don't like this at all. I think probably playing WO and hoping to draw bingo maybe through this R or this A in re-earns next turn, and hoping that I can't hit anything there makes sense. So yeah, that looks reasonable. Here I'm again close to bingos. I have Rapidist and Traipsed through this R, but neither of them fit on the board. So I played Idle here, which is a cool play. It sets up my S for Seidel, and there are no more S's unseen. There is the blank, which he could make an S and possibly get a big play, or even worse, a bingo there on the A column. So that's certainly a risk I run. But I felt that the upside was extremely high. APST is a great leave, especially in this pool where there's 4 more E's to draw, several I's, a few R's, which work great with my leave. So I'm quite likely to get a bingo there next turn. And if I play something like Padel, which I did also consider, I do score a few more points. But now the problem is if he bingos through one of these floaters in re-earns, he'll also simultaneously be exhausting this part of the board and not really leaving me any counter options. And at that point, he'll probably be taking about a 40-point lead, and it may actually be tough for me to come back. Whereas after Idle, I'm giving myself options no matter what he does next turn. If he bingos through one of these tiles in re-earns, then I'll have the A column all to myself to hit for the next turn, and probably several turns after, even if I don't hit it then, since it's extremely difficult for him to block, which is another nice thing. Like, he'd pretty much, I think, just have to, assuming he doesn't have the blank, he'd pretty much just have to play an O over here to make okay. There's really no other ways for him to block this. So that's another major strength of the Idle setup. And yeah, I mean, I could also do something like Pad over here. I think I considered this and a few other plays in that spot, which is more of a defensive play, so it takes a 30-point lead and closes the best bingo lines on the board. And it does keep a nice leave in EIST, but the problem with this leave is it's a bit weak as far as scoring goes. So if I draw a few more one-pointers without a bingo, and he has the Z, he could actually pretty easily outscore me on this board without bingoing, and that wasn't really a risk I wanted to run. If I were up another 30 points or so on top of what I'm up now, then Pad looks like a really strong play, but I don't think I'm up quite enough to justify that kind of defense. So I think Idle is a really strong play here. I'm definitely happy I came up with this. I would definitely do this again. Here he gets down Latiner to the R, and my setup does pay off. Any of these 3 bingos are perfectly fine. I ended up going with type hands, and this is actually a really interesting position for him, and he played Haji, which is actually a mistake, and I'm going to pull up Quackle to demonstrate why. So this is the position in Quackle. I'm just going to move the webcam over here. The problem with Haji, which he played, is he scores 36, but he's still going to be down 26 points going into the endgame, and there's only 2 tiles in the bag. So he'll be drawing 6 tiles on his next rack, so he won't have any bingo threats. And it's not going to be hard to see that my rack over here, which will be 7 out of these 9 tiles, is flexible enough to go out in 2. So he's going to only have 1 more turn after Haji, and between 2 more of my plays and a 26-point deficit he'll still have going into the endgame. I won't go through all the possibilities in detail, but it's not that hard to see that no matter what he draws after Haji, he will be losing pretty easily if I play reasonably well in the endgame. So Haji is never going to win. And it's not that hard to conclude that he's going to need to bingo to win this game. There is another option here of playing Fermi over here for 61 points, burning the blank, which scores really, really well and basically ties the game. The problem is it keeps HJ, and that's just not going to leave him enough flexibility in the endgame. If he draws the Z, then he's not going to be able to unload both the J and the Z. If he somehow draws ZE with the idea of playing G's through one of these E's, then I'll be able to address that very easily by just playing something like Avion from this A over here, or maybe even Ovine to this E, and it's again not difficult to see that I'll be able to win quite easily in the endgame. The other possibility is if for my, let's say he picks up the N, right? In this case, now he'd be threatening to go out with John for a lot of points over here next to Taipans. But what I can do in this case is just play something like Visor over here, saving ED and scoring 40 points. And again, he's going to be losing very easily since now he can't go out with John anywhere, and I'll be going out next turn. So Fermi doesn't win at all, and it turns out his best play here is a 1 in 36 win with just Haj. And the idea with Haj is if he draws N blank. So if instead of his O, he has a N. So if this is my rack, then I'm actually lost in this position because his rack is infirm blank, and he's threatening to bingo with Haji and infirmed through this E for over 100, and he's also threatening to bingo through this E with infirmed or misinfer, and it turns out I can't actually block both of these. I could play something like overdue through this E, which blocks both those bingos, but then I'll be giving back infirms and OS under overdue. So I'll ask championship player here just to demonstrate, but it does turn out that in this position I'm completely lost. I have no plays that will win this game, and I can't score enough to outrun his bingos. So yeah, Champ says my best play is zeroed, which does block the higher scoring infirmed, but then he just goes out with, as I said, infirmed or misinfer through this E, and will win by 19. So that was a cool opportunity for HastyBot in this position to try to steal the win, and this would have only won 1 in 36 of the time since he needed specifically to draw an E and an N, and there's 2 tiles unseen, which means 9 possible tiles for him to draw from. 9 choose 2 is 36, so there's 36 possible 2-tile draws, and with only 1 E and 1 N, there's only one way out of 36 for him to pick up those tiles, so it would be a 1 in 36 chance of him hitting that win. So not a good chance, but still worth going for. It wouldn't have mattered in this case. I didn't have the Z, so he would have picked up the Z and not been able to win anyway. I didn't play a good endgame here since I was getting a bit low on time. I just had to make sure I didn't give him back a big 70-point Z play. Like, I have to be careful about something like Devoir here, because then he can play Fez on top, making F, E, E, N, and Z for like 70 points. And I do actually think I would still win. I looked at this after, but it's very close and uncomfortable. So I ended up just playing Void, which I don't think is the optimal endgame, but it was good enough. He plays Fezes, and I go out with Nor and won by a score of 434 to 403, so a 31-point victory. And yeah, very interesting game. Really, my main mistake here was playing Chris instead of Snarkier. That was just a careless case of tunnel vision. But otherwise, I think I played really well, and lots of cool decisions like Boxla and Idol and Ageism were all pretty interesting. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that one. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at game number 26. So in this game, I was first, and I had a pretty interesting opening rack here. I have Beghorz. I ended up playing Hog for 14 points. The thing is, there really aren't a lot of good plays with my Z. In fact, you see none of them actually show up on Hasty's list of top static plays, because really all I can do with the Z is something like 0, and it scores 26, but BGH is a really bad leave. It doesn't leave myself good potential for bingoing, or really just having a balanced rack at all for the next turn. So I quickly discarded that idea, and I was between mostly Hog, and Gob, and I actually felt that normally I don't love B's, but the BZ actually goes pretty well. With this leave, I can draw things like Braze or Breeze pretty easily, or something like EHRZ. Normally, like EHR is better than BER for sure, but with the Z, I don't have as much I can draw here. I could maybe get down something like Hertz or Hazer next turn, but just in general, the BRZ combo works pretty well, whereas the HRZ can work, but will require more specific tiles to go with it. So I think Hog looks perfectly good here. He responds with Unmew, which looks reasonable. Here I played Zag. I could consider Gazed for a few more points, but BTER is a much stronger leave, and this also unnecessarily gives back a really good bingo line through this E for a double-double as well as a floating D. So Zag looks pretty clear here. He plays Onlay, which looks good, scores quite well. IL, not the best leave, but definitely not the worst, so that looks solid on his part. Yeah, here I didn't have anything great. I played Bread for 30, keeping ER, which looks fine. Really, all of my best plays, as you can see, are in that spot. I could play something a little bit shorter, like Bar, but I just didn't feel DEER was that good a leave, especially on this board. Really, the only good place for me to bingo would be next to Onlay over here. And I just didn't feel, between the possibility of him going there himself and blocking that spot, and just the likelihood of me hitting it, I didn't feel that was worth the sacrifice for 7 points as opposed to playing Bread, which still does keep a pretty strong leave of ER in its own right. So I think Bread is quite reasonable here. He plays Overlie for 21, which is a bit of an aggressive play, putting an I right here. Of course, if I have a Q or an X, I'll be scoring 50 or 60 next turn, so he might want to consider something like Viola here. It's a slight sacrifice in leave since IO is worse than AI, but he's not really down much, and I don't think he needs to be that concerned about opening all those lanes yet. I would probably err on the side of being a little bit more cautious if I were him, and preventing me from getting a huge play there and in taking a larger lead that he's going to have a harder time coming back from. So I think I would have probably gone with Viola or Voila in this position, but I don't hate this. As long as I don't have a Q or an X, then it shouldn't be catastrophic. So he just needs to hope to avoid that, which he does manage to do. And I wasn't thrilled for those same reasons about playing Briary and leaving that spot open if he were to pick up one of those tiles, but I just don't really have a lot of options that will go there. I mean, I could play something like Buy for 23, but keeping 2 eyes is really not good at all. There's still 6 more unseen. If I draw a third, I'm probably going to be looking at an exchange next turn, and EIIRS is pretty terrible on this board. It doesn't bingo well with the floating R over here or the floating U, and there just aren't really a lot of lines for 7s. So I think Briary is good here, just to score pretty well, unload more tiles, and hopefully I can pick up a blank or one of the Q or the X next turn to score with. He does draw the X and hits his X bomb for 57. Luckily for me, I do have a bingo playable with this dreadful looking rack at first. Thankfully, Hen does take a front S, so I'm able to get down ninnies with Shen for 67. He plays Ganja through this N, which is probably reasonable. He could consider a Juga over here just to get rid of an extra vowel, but he is giving up 8 points and also leaving the N open, so it's actually pretty close on static. Ganja's only about a third of a point better. That's how much worse IOU is versus IO. So it's definitely a close decision, but I don't hate this. Just to take out that N. He's not going to really be down that much. So if he can just pull a couple constants out of the pool, and the pool is slightly constant heavy. It's 32 constants versus 20 vowels. So if he can just pull a couple constants, he should be in okay shape after Ganja. So a close call for him here. I've got a lot of vowels myself, and they all happen to be E's. I almost played Exited here. That was the first play I saw, but I ultimately decided on Teamed. And the main reason I chose Teamed was to play 2 extra tiles to go for one of the 2 blanks here. There's still 2 blanks unseen. We're about halfway through the game already, so turnover is becoming more and more of a factor, as in a close game like this, without too many easy bingo lines on this board, getting the blanks will be very important for trying to bingo in one of the marginal lanes or score a lot of points to secure the victory in the game. So I felt Teamed was worth it to turn over more tiles for the blanks, and also with Exited, I mean, I'm not too worried about keeping the 2 E's since there aren't too many E's left to draw, but this E that I'm floating is going to be more useful for him than for me. Since I already have 2 more E's, it's going to be very hard for me to use that E to bingo through, whereas it actually will work very well with a lot of racks he has that may be a little bit more constant heavy. Of course, I do still float this E with teamed, but the E at the end of the word is generally a little bit easier to use than at the beginning because he can make a lot of words ending in things like ED or ER or ES. So those were the main reasons I ended up going with teamed, but really the main one was because of the extra turnover for the blanks. He plays Tori here, which looks good. He definitely wants to score some points to get back even in this game, and yeah, he's also turning over a lot of tiles. I would not want to fish here. Definitely don't like Gyro. It's 18 more points. It plays off one less tile, and yeah, just keeping a balanced leave here on a board like this with 2 blanks unseen is much less important than scoring more points and going for more turnover. So that looks pretty good. Here I was very fortunate to have Furrow available with FUW, of course, not the draw you ever really want to see, but in this case, thankfully, I'm able to unload my tiles and score a lot of points. He plays Request here, which looks quite good. It's really going to come down to, most likely at this point, who can pick up the blanks, just because there's still 2 of them unseen. We're getting down to about the last third or quarter of the game, so someone's going to get one very soon, and with it being a close game, the next bingo could very well decide it. So here I once again don't pull a blank. I go ahead and play Chafe. You could make an argument for playing Chefs just because the pool is a little bit consonant heavy, so keeping the 2 vowels in the consonant is a little bit nicer. At the same time, the S does still have some value, especially Requests and Sev could be a useful play for me to score some points on the next turn, and also obstruct this new 7s line he created. So I do think the S has enough merit here to be worth saving, but it's worth considering at least. Tough draw for the bot here. He still doesn't have a blank. He plays Fort, which looks reasonable. He really doesn't have a lot of other options. He could consider Cleft here, which he may want to do, since he's starting to get to the point where he's going to need to bingo to win this game. I don't ever see him winning after Fort without a bingo. He'll still be down 30. CLT is not a good leave for scoring, so he could take the position that after Cleft, he's giving himself another bingo line. ORT is a lot more flexible, especially keeping a vowel is nice in a slightly consonant-heavy pool, and he's opening that T for him to work with should he draw one of the blanks or the S's or other better bingo tiles. So I do think that Cleft may actually be a better point. After Chafe, he's already down 60, and if he doesn't bingo, it's hard to imagine him winning the game. So I think trying to force the issue with Cleft actually makes a bit more sense. Here I played Updove through this DO, which I was pretty happy with, since I keep OST, which is a nice leave for the pool. I turn over 4 tiles for the blank, and I also do block this line over here next to Request, and at this point I'm sort of thinking the opposite of him. If I can stop him from bingoing, then I should be in a very good position, since I'll be up 60 points, and even if he gets both blanks, if he doesn't bingo, it's not that easy for him to score on this board. So at this point I'm sort of switching gears towards trying to stop him from bingoing. There is a nice play I missed here of Voodoo through this DO, but the problem is, while I do set up my S nicely, I also set up his potential S as well as an N, since Voodoo is valid, and of course with 2 blanks, and my priority being not so much to bingo myself, but make sure he doesn't bingo, I think Updove makes a lot more sense, since Updove doesn't take any hooks, and there is not enough room to bingo through this E. You only have space to play 6 tiles before you run into Request. So I think Updove looks quite reasonable here. He plays Elk. I would have gone with Fluke if I were him. Again, Elk is sort of just committing himself to a passive position. He's still going to be down 30. ACIT is not particularly good for scoring, and where's he bingoing on this board? I mean, after I take care of this G as well as the N on the top left, there really isn't anywhere left for him to bingo. He could maybe hit something with 3 overlaps next to Request, but his rack is not at all conducive to that, especially since the C can't overlap any of these tiles, and he can only put an I after the S. So we'd have to start with like TIA or something like that. It's going to be very hard for him to use. So I think he's got to be more aggressive here and play Fluke. Here I did draw a blank, and I played Gallipots, which is pretty clearly the best play. Honorable mention, of course, to the very cool 9 of Postilion, which I did not see. But of course, it's not a good play because he could potentially triple out with something through this P with his blank and win the game. So I definitely need to just play Gallipots, and even if he does hit something like Diatron on the right next to Request, I should hold on pretty easily to win. As it turns out, he didn't have the other blank, so he just plays Askai over here, and I go out with Norland through this L and this N to win the game by a score of 414 to 330. So another good win for us. I felt I played very well that game. Definitely some interesting turns, especially teamed, upped over both pretty cool. My opening rack was actually a bit unusual as well, so definitely some interesting turns that game, and yeah, we came away with a win in both game number 25 and game number 26. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that analysis, and once again, I do apologize for the audio issues and the lack of full videos for games 25 and 26, but we will be back on track for game number 27 tomorrow and going forward. So I appreciate you guys' patience, and I do hope that you at least got something out of this video and maybe learned something. And yeah, of course, feel free as always to comment with any suggestions or alternative play ideas that I may have missed. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for game number 27. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.